38 trophies in 26 years under Alex Ferguson. In the 12 years since his retirement, United have ripped through 7 managers with just 7 trophies to show for it. The tactical approaches have varied wildly between the managers, a big reason for their continued failure. But these are the failed tactics of every Manchester United manager. David Moyes was the man tasked with taking charge of the helm after the great Sir Alex Ferguson left. It seemed like a decent option. He was an established Premier League manager who consistently had lesser teams punching above their weight, sitting just shy of the very elite table. But it was slightly less ambitious than many would have anticipated. After all, this Scotsman had only won a Football League Second Division trophy compared to the cabinetful that the departing legend had accumulated. But little did the Red Devils know that this would be the first domino in a chain reaction that saw Manchester United go through multiple managers in subsequent years, desperately attempting to recreate either the stability or the success that Fergie had made look effortless, but achieving neither. A slow start in the transfer market was a sign of what was to come for the Reds. His summer transfer window was a masterclass in indecision. Despite targeting players like Thiago, Fabregas, Kroos and Bale, the only arrival was his former Everton charge, Marouane Fellaini, secured on deadline day for an inflated £27 million after dithering over his release clause. But the real issue wasn't just who he signed, it was how he deployed them. Moyes didn't try to overhaul the United shape at all. After all, the hybrid 4-4-1-1, 4-2-3-1 is what he was already using at Everton, and it had brought success for United the season prior. And his preferred 11 looked like this initially, with his only signing, Fellaini, slotting in alongside Michael Carrick in the midfield. But this graph begins to show the tactical cracks in Moyes' Manchester United. No team was attacking through the centre of the pitch less often than the Red Devils. But why was that? It came down to this. Carrick, while excellent on the ball as always, was slowly beginning to age, and he had never been the most mobile. And he was paired with Fellaini, who excelled at Everton playing much higher up the pitch, almost as a second forward. But of course, the presence of a world-class front two meant that there was no way the Belgian could displace either of these two men. Dropping him into a deep lying role negated everything that made him effective, while exposing his limitations as a ball-playing midfielder. When Carrick was marked out of games, something that happened with increasing frequency, as opponents cottoned onto the fact that United were heavily reliant on him, Fellaini had to become the primary progressive passer. The result was predictable. Opposition teams were delighted to see Fellaini on the ball in deep positions. His limited passing range and tendency to take too many touches meant that attacks broke down before they could even develop any momentum. United's possession had become sterile, circulating harmlessly between the defenders and the double pivot without ever threatening the final third. Effectively, despite Rooney looking to drop in from high up to help the cause at times, the ball was often getting stuck in the United midfield rather than reaching the final third, meaning that from the top teams, Moyes' United spent the least time in the opposition's third, as they never had any sustained pressure there. But this was also paired with some other tactical factors. Moyes at Everton was never a possession-oriented manager. His philosophy was built on directness and physicality. Get the ball forward quickly, press high when out of possession, and rely on set pieces and second balls to create chances, which is why the Toffees had transitioned Fellaini higher up the pitch as a get-out-of-jail free card when they needed to move up the pitch rapidly. So progressing through the thirds methodically was never part of his DNA. So that, paired with the limited double pivot, meant that United often went long to skip this midfield. And here's the thing, injuries became a factor fairly early on in the Moyes reign, with Fellaini and the lethal assassin Robin van Persie facing significant spells out, meaning that the pivot position often saw a fair bit of Cleverley, an aging Fletcher, Phil Jones, and the even more aged Ryan Giggs filling in when Fellaini was unavailable. Van Persie's injury saw Rooney, who had been falling out of favour under Fergie, pushed back to a centre-forward role. While in theory it does look like this would allow an extra midfielder in a 10 position to assist, the truth is Rooney was already beginning to transition to a deeper role, so he was already dropping in to help the pivots when he was deployed at 10. But the number 10s who came to replace him were true 10s, who actually wanted to stay between the lines rather than drop in and help the pivots. United struggled through the centre, and without Rooney in the hole, they struggled to create, as the likes of Kagawa barely saw minutes, even with Rooney pushed up higher. So eventually, seeking a solution, Manchester United also began to bypass the midfield more and more, with their play getting progressively longer and more direct. When it worked, well, it showed glimmers of potential, with the longer play letting them get into advanced areas quickly to get into as many shot-creating situations as possible. But when it wasn't working, United were caught high up in this strange scenario, where either they had sterile possession and struggled to play through the centre, or they were pumping it long, leading to rapid turnovers. Seeking this creative central spark, Januzaj drifted in from the left earlier and earlier, becoming a pseudo number 10, but eventually United knew that they had to address the creative issue. Juan Mata was brought in a bit of a coup, as the Spaniard, despite rapidly falling out of favour in the Mourinho era, was still the reigning back-to-back Chelsea player of the season, and as such, he demanded a huge fee for the time. And when he slotted in at 10, he did provide a genuine outlet, getting on the ball and threading through dangerous passes to Rooney and the wingers ahead of him. In fact, he actually finished with the third most goal contributions, despite playing less than half the minutes available for United in the league. But Moyes was already beginning to run himself into dilemmas. See, it's not like Van Persie would be injured every single match. And now, Moyes had a world-class forward, a club legend, and the club record signing, all effectively vying for 2 spots. And where Ferguson had begun to phase Rooney out in his last season as manager, Moyes had leaned heavily on him. It was Mata who took the hit, and was moved out to the right wing, where he struggled heavily and was a shell of his former self in certain games. But still, United struggled to play through the centre. So what would Moyes' solution be? Get it wide, as often as possible. The wingers, particularly before Mata came in, tended to begin wide, and Moyes encouraged the fullbacks to also overlap outside of them to create 2 versus 1 opportunities whenever possible. The goal was simple: get as many crosses into the box as possible. When Rooney and Van Persie were both present, they had 2 targets to hit, and this strategy did show potential, but when Rooney was the solo forward, well, they barely had any box presence, as often he would be dropping deeper for the cutback. That didn't stop the Red Devils from being the heaviest crosses per game in the league. The approach wasn't inherently flawed. Crossing can be devastatingly effective when executed with precision and purpose. Liverpool under Jurgen Klopp would later demonstrate how a cross-heavy side could dominate a league competition. But Moyes' version lacked the crucial elements that make such tactics successful: movement in the box, varied elite delivery, and unpredictable crossing positions. United's crossing became mechanically predictable. Opponents knew that once the ball reached the flanks, a cross was inevitable. They could defend narrowly, pack their penalty area, and wait for the ball to be delivered into regions where they had numerical superiority. The absence of late runs from midfield, a consequence of the static double pivot, meant that United rarely had players arriving at the back post or the edge of the area to capitalize on knockdowns. The peak of this came in a 2-2 draw against Fulham. Take a look at this graphic. Every one of those lines represents a cross. United launched 81 crosses into the box and had no attacking plan outside of that. The United game plan was basic, straightforward, and easy to defend against, Fulham head coach and former United coach René Moulenstein would say after the game. And it was true. Fulham were perfectly happy doing this, defending compact with all 11 players in the width of the box to force United wide, knowing that they could easily defend the cross when it came in. Less than a season after Ferguson, United were already looking like a shell of their former selves. The defensive end of things also caused a rift with the fans in 2 ways. One key adjustment Moyes had not made was the realization that United had to be the protagonist. Manchester United were the kings of England, and as such, needed to impose their will on opponents. Moyes, on the other hand, was reactive, spending most of his energy trying to nullify the opponent rather than exploiting their weaknesses using United's own strengths. In defensive phases, this presented as immediately looking to fall back into a defensive shape as quickly as they could, rather than quickly trying to win the ball back. Long spells out of possession were the result. And while United were decent defensively, this wasn't the hyper-aggressive offensive style that Old Trafford had become accustomed to. Part of the reason for immediately dropping into defense was the rest defense. With both fullbacks high and an immobile double pivot, they were incredibly vulnerable, and they had to drop as quickly as possible to compensate for this, because otherwise scenarios like this were quite common. Fellaini and Carrick both caught high in the transition, and City on the counter-attack move into the fullback area easily. The most damning part is that Kompany, the centre-back, runs past both pivots to get into the box as City eventually score. The deeper defensive line also neutered United's counter-attacking threat. Ferguson's teams had been devastating in transition because they won the ball back in advanced positions and had the pace to exploit disorganized defenses. Moyes' United won possession deeper, giving opponents the time to reorganize, and this nullified United's main source of goals, and crucially, stripped them of part of their identity. This meek attitude from Moyes could spill into the press room at times. After being humiliated 3-0 at home by Manchester City, Moyes only made matters worse by declaring that the citizens were at a level that United could only aspire to.
And it's a sort of standard and level we need to try and aspire ourselves to get at this moment in time.
That sort of talk was deemed unacceptable for a side that had won the league less than a year prior. Moyes' 10-month tenure represented more than just tactical failure. It was a lesson in the importance of understanding a team's identity. United had always been a club that imposed its will on opponents, that played with courage and ambition regardless of the circumstances. Moyes had replaced this with caution and pragmatism, turning one of football's greatest entertainers into a team that even their own fans struggled to watch. The irony is, many of Moyes' individual tactics weren't fundamentally wrong. Crossing can be effective, defensive solidity is important, and pragmatism has its place in elite football. But tactics without context are meaningless, and Moyes never understood that at United, how you play can be just as important as whether you win. The first domino had fallen, and United's long journey through the tactical wilderness was just beginning. The answer, United figured, was somebody with a stronger tactical identity. But they still wanted an established manager. But instead of going for Premier League pedigree, it was a manager who had made his name on the continent and was coming off the back of a deep run in the World Cup with his home nation. Louis van Gaal walked through the doors in 2014, and his arrival represented a fundamental shift in United's approach to football. That strong tactical identity we talked about? Well, Van Gaal arrived at Old Trafford with an unshakable belief in his philosophy, a possession-based system that had brought him success at Ajax, Barcelona, Bayern Munich, and with the Netherlands. His transfer strategy reflected his tactical approach. Ander Herrera to somewhat increase the ball-playing ability in that midfield that had struggled so much. Angel Di Maria, a winger but subsequently used to provide drive and creativity from central areas, and Daley Blind, a technical defender who could help to initiate attacks from deep. And that was just scratching the surface, as Rojo, Shaw, and others were also brought in, while Falcao looked to add offensive threat. Van Gaal's opening gambit was characteristically audacious, a complete transformation to a back three system that bore no resemblance to anything that United had played in recent memory. The Dutchman was nothing if not committed to his convictions, but reality has a way of humbling early innovators. As soon as his first game, the issues with his approach were present. The opening fixture against Swansea exposed a fundamental flaw in Van Gaal's approach. Gary Monk's side simply dropped into a compact 4-2-4 defensive block and invited United's centre-back trio of Chris Smalling, Phil Jones and Tyler Blackett to play with the ball. The problem was obvious to everyone except Van Gaal. These defenders possessed neither the technical ability nor the vision to hurt opponents from deep. It was a blueprint that Burnley and Sunderland would copy with devastating effect. The stats from Van Gaal's opening 3 games told a damning story. 60% possession against Swansea, 64 versus Burnley, and 55 versus Sunderland. But only 2 goals in 270 minutes of football. It was beginning to look like flawed thinking from the Dutchman, as he was importing a system designed for technically superior players without having the technically superior players. This was one of the reasons that United pushed so hard late in the window for Daley Blind. But one ball-playing centre-back does not make a positional team tick. Van Gaal realized that he had to tweak his tactical approach. The squad wasn't quite ready to transition to the 3. The shift to a 4-4-2 diamond represented a tacit admission that his original plan had been fundamentally flawed, but it also revealed his capacity for adaptation when cornered. The diamond formation slowly transformed United's central areas from a weakness into a strength. With 4 midfielders in close proximity, they could finally execute more of the short, intricate passing combinations that Van Gaal craved. This was aided by Luke Shaw's recovery from injury, which now provided them genuine width down the left. But the most inspired tactical wrinkle was around this man. In his last season at Madrid, Ancelotti had begun using him more and more centrally, but the assumption had been that coming off the back of an incredible Champions League final performance, Di Maria would be moved back to his now preferred wide position. But in the diamond, he was used just off the left, getting on the ball plenty. The Argentine's role was specifically designed to inject chaos into Van Gaal's ordered system. While the other midfielders were instructed to maintain possession at all costs, Di Maria was given the license to drive forward with the ball. To take risks, to provide the unpredictability that could unlock stubborn defenses. And for a brief period, this marriage of structure and spontaneity looked genuinely promising. Di Maria was devastating in his opening spell, with his first 10 league matches seeing him score 3 times and assist 6. But in the background, Van Gaal was still working on moving the side more and more towards his system, more and more towards a highly structured, highly positional way of playing. With every passing week, the football became more autocratic. Every pass had to be optimized and prioritize possession. The football became increasingly rigid and mechanical. Every pass had to serve the system. Every movement had to prioritize possession retention over penetration. Di Maria, a player who thrived on instinct and improvisation, found himself suffocated by the very structure that had initially liberated him. The slower, methodological build-up play was also the result of the personnel of the front line. With Rooney at 10 and dropping in to assist the build-up as necessary, the issue was United did not have runners breaking beyond the line to add the threat of the pass over the top, as the forwards were beginning to age. The fullbacks in the back four or the wingbacks in the back 5 would look to provide the width, but as they were starting from so deep, they still had to keep one eye on defense, so their running power was never consistent enough to provide genuine depth to stretch the opposition. So Van Gaal figured if it couldn't be pure physicality that would break down opponents, it had to be the intricate passing. But 2 things were consistent problems in Van Gaal's first season: injuries and tweaking the formula. The high rate of injuries did affect the personnel available to the Dutchman, but there was also a sense he was constantly caught in a mental tug of war between adapting to the team and the league or sticking to his philosophy. Despite the success of the diamond, he soon shifted back to the back 3 for a spell, and then back to the diamond before settling on the 4-3-3, which he declared was his preferred formation. Again, it created an interesting dichotomy. Blind held progression of the ball, helping United get up the pitch in a structured manner, but provided little width. But when you look at this midfield trio, what do you see? Good in possession, good runner, physicality and a goal threat, but what you don't see is creativity. Van Persie's injuries had again forced Rooney high, and Mata was still only drifting in from the right. So what the Old Trafford faithful saw was a highly structured, slow, positional side with no creativity, who, when they ran out of ideas, would just lump it long to Fellaini.
After 70 minutes we don't succeed in spite of many chances in the second half. Then I changed my play style, and then of course with the quality of Fellaini we played more forward strikers.
In fact, it even led to West Ham's Allardyce accusing Manchester United of being a long ball team.
And I suppose in the end we couldn't cope with long ball United, you know. It was just thump it forward and see what they could get in the end, and it paid off for them, you know. So coping with that long ball sometimes when you got a Fellaini up there was difficult for us. It's not how you normally see Man United play.
To which Van Gaal fought back.
West Ham United has played 71% of the long balls to the forwards, and we 49.
But the weaknesses in this tactical approach from United were getting clearer to the league week by week. Teams again began to adjust. A 1-0 loss to Mourinho's Chelsea was the perfect example of how to beat this Van Gaal side. Chelsea gave United 70% possession, sitting deep and daring United's midfield to conjure up anything that resembled the creativity needed to break a deep block. And despite United taking several shots, none of them were classed as a big chance, as the Reds ended with less than 1 XG. But there were advantages to this new 4-3-3, and the brightest spark of this revision to the 4-3-3 was the press. Earlier in the season, as Van Gaal was getting the lay of the land, United were passive defensively, but now they switched to a more aggressive, man-oriented press, regularly allowing less than 8 passes per defensive action in this phase, aided by the setup of that 4-3-3. The season was by no means a disaster. United finished 4th, but still the pressure was beginning to mount on Van Gaal. The following season's window aimed to address the issues. Schneiderlin and Schweinsteiger were brought in to help that lethargic midfield, while Depay and Martial hoped to add some dynamism to the front line. Importantly, these signings were brought in not to revolutionize Van Gaal's style, but rather to double down and elevate his existing style. The formation had stabilized to a 4-2-3-1, with Van Gaal looking to have more fluidity between the lines, with the three behind Rooney showing a lot more flexibility, and at their best they did do just that. But in general, some of the same problems were present. Rooney had aged and at times struggled to hold down the front line at all when it came to running in behind, with Martial constantly cutting in and Shaw missing the season due to a leg break. Blind was struggling to provide the deep running from the left, but the struggles were less about the personnel on paper, but the reality on the pitch. Van Gaal's doubling down on the calculated patterns of play meant that they attacked incredibly slowly. In fact, they had the second most possession in the league, and they got from their own third to the middle third just fine. But with the wingers coming in off both flanks, they were narrow and predictable, meaning it rarely translated to a goal threat, and only 5 teams took less shots per game than them, and 3 of those 5 got relegated. It was only when injury forced Van Gaal to introduce younger players like Marcus Rashford and Jesse Lingard did United's attack gain any semblance of unpredictability. These players, unburdened by months of tactical conditioning, brought the directness and instinct that Van Gaal's system had systematically eliminated from more experienced players. Rashford's emergence was particularly telling. His pace and willingness to run in behind provided the one element that Van Gaal's possession-heavy approach had been missing, the threat of quick, vertical transitions. But, to be fair, the one advantage of Van Gaal's style of play was that the defense was pretty solid, with United conceding the joint least goals in the league. But Van Gaal's tenure ended as it had begun, with absolute conviction in his methods, despite overwhelming evidence of his failure. His refusal to abandon the process in the face of mounting criticism was admirable but at the same time catastrophic. He had created a tactical identity, but it was one that fundamentally misunderstood what made Manchester United Manchester United. The FA Cup win that ended his tenure was fitting. Even in triumph, United's performance was defined more by defensive solidity and opponent errors rather than the flowing and attacking football that the club's supporters craved. Van Gaal's legacy wasn't about tactical innovation, but tactical stubbornness. A cautionary tale about the danger of prioritizing philosophical purity over practical effectiveness. And if you've gotten this far into the video, you're probably a true tactical nerd. And if you've ever wanted to understand the tactical principles that allow elite teams to function, I've put together a free resource to get you started on your tactical analysis journey. Just click the top link in the description or the comments. So United went from a proven Premier League manager with no clear tactical identity to a manager with a strong positional identity but no Premier League experience, and now to a serial winner in the Premier League with a clear but pragmatic tactical identity. His mantra was simple: poets don't win many titles. The haphazard nature of United's managerial recruitment was beginning to become clear, but the excitement as the special one walked through the Old Trafford doors was palpable. The backing was immediate and substantial. Eric Bailly arrived to add steel and mobility to the backline, while creativity concerns were addressed by bringing in the Bundesliga's Player of the Season in Henrik Mkhitaryan. Most significantly, they broke the world transfer record to bring Paul Pogba back from Juventus, pairing him with the arrival of Zlatan Ibrahimovic on a free. On paper, it looked like a recipe for success. Mourinho wanted to play a 4-3-3, but the big issue came right here. Schneiderlin and Schweinsteiger had departed. Carrick could and still did play the role at times, but at this point he was 35 and had never been the most mobile. That left Mourinho with a bunch of midfielders who could play as a solo pivot, but Mourinho did not trust them to do so completely. So to compensate more often, he switched to a 4-2-3-1 with a Herrera-Pogba double pivot to give them additional balance, but this fundamentally altered the team structure. While United maintained healthy possession stats, 5th highest in the league, this was more a byproduct of the squad's quality rather than philosophical intent. Under Van Gaal, possession had been the foundation. Under Mourinho, it was merely a means to an end. Against weaker sides in particular, Mourinho was happy to dominate the ball and be more controlled with it. Pogba instantly became the hub of United's play, consistently registering the most touches and serving as the primary progressive force from deep. His range of passing was exceptional, whether it was breaking the lines with short passes, switching play with breaking diagonals, or threading through balls into the final third. The Frenchman had solved United's progression issues, but herein lay the fundamental problem. Pogba was the heartbeat of the team, and it was no secret. Smart teams quickly identified that and systematically looked to cut passing lanes into him, forcing play through his pivot partner, where the progression issues began to rear their ugly heads again. But when they did progress, there was an issue that they faced. Despite having both Mata and Mkhitaryan on the books, the number 10 tended to be one of Rooney or Lingard, with Mata and Mkhitaryan alternating, starting on the right flank instead. Rooney, legend though he was, had broken through at an extremely tender age, and the years at the top meant that he wasn't slowly deteriorating, and instead he was falling off a cliff. He wasn't awful creatively or as a midfield goal threat in his final season, but Mourinho was aiming to win the league, and the output of just 5 goals and 5 assists wasn't quite world class. Lingard, on the other hand, was deep into being a young player, but was struggling to show his ability, meaning at times the same lack of central creativity reared its ugly head. The right wingers would drift in centrally to alleviate this and provide some level of creative threat. But again, the now age-old issue of central creativity threatened to be an issue when teams sat in and defended compactly. The league knew something. Pogba had solved their midfield progression, but the Frenchman couldn't be everywhere at once to also look to create high up the pitch. So to a certain extent, they could afford to be more passive as long as Pogba wasn't allowed to get high up into the creative positions, and this led to United drawing 15 games. Ironically, this need for Pogba to push high up to also create led to the Paul Pogba paradox. He wasn't a holding midfielder by trade, but he was filling in well enough. But when United came up against these compact defenses, he would have to push up to be the creator. This naturally left the remaining pivot isolated, so if United did lose the ball, the threat of the counter was ever present. To prevent this, as the season went on, especially in the biggest matches, Carrick was reintroduced alongside Herrera to allow Pogba to create from the 10 position while keeping that midfield solidity. But in addition to this, in his preferred formation, Mourinho always had a plan B. Unlike Van Gaal, who used the strategy with an element of sheepishness, when the situation demanded, Jose wore his pragmatism like a badge of honor, and would move Fellaini into the 10 position on occasion, allowing United to skip all the progression and the opposition's compact shape to immediately get up the pitch. It was incredibly effective, with the tower-like Belgian bringing it down onto his chest or winning flick-ons to have United bearing down on goal in an instant late on in games. This was of course aided by another world-class aerial presence, Zlatan Ibrahimovic, who was going at a great pace in his debut season. So that was the centre, but what was happening down the width in these instances? Mourinho had been one of the early adopters of inverted wingers in his career, and that trend continued, opting for a creator coming in central, like Mata or Mkhitaryan. But down the left it was all about goal threat, through Rashford and Martial, who both preferred to play as inside forwards. Again, when the space was there, this was effective in increasing both the creativity and the goal threat. But when the opponent sat narrow, there was no room to maneuver. Of course, large onus was placed on the fullbacks as a result to provide all of the width. But here was the issue. Valencia down the right was a woeful crosser, often just blasting it low and hard and hoping for the best. The left back was either Daley Blind or the right-footed Darmian. Blind was more of a pass-oriented fullback, so wasn't exactly tearing up the flank to get crosses in, while Darmian off the left wasn't particularly renowned for whipping crosses in. So this United team that was blessed with incredibly tall players breaking into the box often didn't have the requisite quality from the cross to match the aerial threat. By the time the following season rolled round, Mourinho knew that changes were needed, and went big in both the summer and the winter. Injuries and a suspension to Pogba caused issues for United early in the season, forcing them to adapt a more conservative midfield. But once he was available, United's preferred 11 looked like this, with the major changes being Matic and Lukaku. But here's the key: while the formation was not dissimilar from his first season, This man was the key change. In his prior seasons with Chelsea, the Serbian had proved himself to be a freakishly good shield, using his telescopic limbs to protect the defense so effectively in fact that he had helped Kante develop a new element of the game, with the Frenchman now having the freedom to be much more box-to-box, knowing that Matic could cover him. The same was expected of him at United, as he did a lot more of the grunt work, freeing up another Frenchman in Pogba to help with the creativity higher up. And for the most part, it did work, with his goal contributions doubling to 26. But while United certainly elevated in Mourinho's second season, they were just a better version of what they already were, meaning many of the problems were still present. Despite Matic's best efforts, he was still only human, so on occasion if Pogba was straying too high, the Serbian was still left exposed in front of the defense. And this tension between Pogba's attacking instincts and Mourinho's defense-first philosophy created a constant battle that eventually led to a relationship breakdown between the pair, and a portrayal of Pogba as the scapegoat. But before that point, again we saw Mourinho looking to add extra solidity to compensate for Pogba in the biggest games, by introducing an extra midfielder, though this once again left a gaping hole in the top position, affecting the creativity. So again, this led to increased directness, and Lukaku was beginning to suffer from something that many players do, which is being misprofiled. Seeing a tall player who plays at centre forward can lead to assumptions about their ability to hold up the ball like a target man, when the reality may be that they're better at running in behind, like Lukaku. So when United went long to him, sometimes they bounced right off of him, leading to frustration. And inevitably yet again, Mourinho had to turn to Fellaini to come on late to save the game. But a huge problem that was never solved was having a definitive secondary goal scorer. In the prior season, Zlatan had led the line scoring 17. But the next best after him was just 6. And in this season, Lukaku scored 16, and the next best sat at only 9. A lack of goals and tactical fluidity was costing United, and they did try to solve it through a marquee signing in Alexis Sanchez in January. But despite the Chilean having been flying at Arsenal, his goal scoring ground to a halt at United. The truth is, throughout his tenure, Mourinho upgraded the pieces in his side, but never solved the root problems. A lack of central creativity, paired with a lack of wide threat, leading to diminished goal threat. And that was combined with various centre-back pairings that he didn't trust, meaning that he kept his fullbacks conservative rather than bombing on. While in his second season, a second place finish looks great, the underlying numbers reveal a different story. United outperformed their XG by almost 9 goals, whilst De Gea's miraculous season papered over a leaky defense, as the Reds conceded almost 16 goals less than XG suggested they should have. The game is of course not played out in theory, but it is still interesting to note that expected points had them finishing in 6th rather than 2nd. Combine that with strong interpersonal issues that continued into his final partial season, and his tenure was only ever going to end one way. And ironically, just as expected points had suggested, when Mourinho was sacked, United sat in 6th place. Just like Van Gaal, silverware was not enough to save Mourinho's job.
It was only meant to be a fun fling with Ollie, as he came in on an interim basis on the 19th of December. But Solskjaer becoming permanent manager is perhaps the clearest example of United not having a defined managerial strategy. The fundamental issue plaguing United's post-Ferguson era remained unchanged. Each new manager would arrive with their own tactical philosophy, sign a few players to fit their system, get fired when the board lost its patience, leaving behind fragments of incompatible strategies. By the time Solskjaer took charge, United possessed what could only be described as a Frankenstein squad. Talented individuals, but lacking tactical cohesion. Those initial months under Ollie were magical though. Rather than imposing a rigid tactical identity, he operated with what might be called a tactical motto. This is Manchester United, and we should play like it. The transformation began off the pitch, where by the end of his spell, Mourinho was almost licking his lips at the opportunity to criticize his players publicly. Ollie brought a positivity that uplifted the dressing room. That positivity spread onto the pitch, as United were much more forward-facing. He was much more willing to adapt to the opponent, splitting between a 4-2-3-1, a 4-3-3, and a diamond. However, these weren't random changes. Each formation was designed to specifically unlock 2 key players, Marcus Rashford and Paul Pogba. Rashford's repositioning from left winger to central striker proved transformative. Operating as the focal point of United's counter-attacking system, his pace became the primary weapon in Solskjaer's tactical arsenal, which relied heavily on the transition. I mean, less than a minute into his debut against Cardiff, that threat of the counter was already beginning to rear its head. Meanwhile, regardless of formation, Pogba was consistently paired with Matic and another midfielder, creating a platform that freed the Frenchman to orchestrate attacks and launch the raking diagonal passes that initiated United's rapid transitions. It was all about simple tactics executed well. Possession or positional play were never the cornerstone for Solskjaer, but rather committing numbers to the attack as they looked to overwhelm the opponent, which could lead to beautiful phases of play like this. Two of the biggest beneficiaries were the fullbacks, as where Mourinho was more conservative with them before, Solskjaer often got both to push up the pitch simultaneously to provide the width early. That was crucial, because if the wingers were present, they liked to tuck in early, or more importantly in the diamond, the wider midfielders didn't like to drift too wide, so the width had to come from the fullbacks. The setup of the diamond was also interesting, as in possession the shape actually morphed into a 4-3-3, with a false 9 in Lingard or Mata, but one of Solskjaer's biggest adaptations was having Lukaku move out to the right wing when in this diamond. He realized that whilst the Belgian could hold up play, his true strength was a runner in behind. So starting from the flank nominally allowed him to firstly bully a fullback aerially when it was needed, but now he could also attack the center at pace, facing the goal rather than with his back to goal. The result of all of this? Goals, and lots of them. During his 19-game interim reign, United scored 40 goals, more than 2 per game, a stark contrast to the tepid end of Jose's reign. And it wasn't just offensive change. The defense was different too. Because of the more conservative attacking approach under Mourinho, there were fewer players committed to the attack, so when they lost the ball, they tended to drop deep. But under Solskjaer, with so many men high on the attack, the Norwegian got his side to counter-press more. So, there was more speed in attack, and more intensity in defense. This was backed by the more diamond shape that they fell into when they had to defend for longer spells, with the front two pressing the wide side of the centre-backs to force central play and walking the opposition straight into their pressing traps. But beneath this impressive resurgence, keen observers were noticing something. Something perhaps the board should have noted before hiring him on a permanent basis. In his interim spell, United were first in the Premier League. But once his spell was made permanent, towards the tail end of the season, they plummeted to 16th for that time period. Was it some dramatic tactical change that caused this? Definitely not. See, even in their winning spell, there had been some holes popping up in the side. There was a reason Mourinho hesitated to commit his fullbacks in attack or to a high press. He did not trust the side to be coordinated or solid enough on the defensive end of things. Ollie's interim side had been conceding chances, but where their 11 conceded in 13 games had them going at less than 1 goal conceded per game, expected goals during that period was over 15. So while United were first by actual points during Ollie's initial reign, painting a flattering picture, expected points actually had them down as only the 3rd best. And fortunes would turn, as following his permanent appointment, a run of just 7 goals from over 12 expected, and 14 conceded from 10.5 expected, meant that now they underperformed their expected points, meaning that the pressure was on in his next season. Ollie looked to mould the team to his image, and in the summer and winter some big names came in, whilst others left. But the biggest issue was Pogba, who immediately struggled with injury this season, only playing the full 90 in 10 matches. Solskjaer's aim of trying to return United to where they were included being the protagonist in more matches, meaning that they needed to have more possession of the ball, so familiar issues began to re-emerge. De Gea's shot stopping was perfect for a team that wanted to sit deep, like a Mourinho. But for a side that wanted to hold on to the ball, his inability to get involved as a third centre-back to gain a numerical advantage against the opposition press began to hamstring the build-up. And slowly he was beginning to be targeted, like Pogba was in the public, as the cause of all of United's woes. It didn't help that the right side of the defense wasn't great on the ball either, and Shaw was again out for prolonged spells with injury. So there was a lot of onus on Maguire and Young to do all the ball progression, meaning that United's attack was heavily biased to the left-hand side. This wasn't helped by having a double pivot that was once again functional with the ball rather than expansive. And while Solskjaer most often used Pereira as the offensive midfielder, he wasn't exactly a creative threat. Matic often had to drop into the backline to assist the build-up when Maguire was being pressed. And while he was a lot better than a centre-back at ball progression, he wasn't exactly a progression monster. Having him drop deep also meant that the 10, whether Lingard or Pereira, would have to drop in to assist the remaining pivot, reducing the threat in those key creative zones. So essentially, United were struggling to arrive in the attacking third with a true 10 ready to orchestrate high-quality opportunities, and as a result, the majority of their shots were coming in from range. Opposition teams quickly identified two effective strategies: press high to disrupt the build-up, or sit deep and allow United's central creativity issues to resurface. And in this season, United's wide players, mainly Rashford and Dan James, were runners from wide rather than creators, limiting United's ability to break down compact defenses through the wide regions to compensate. So once again, United found themselves only being dangerous on the counter, with the pace of Rashford and James paired with the movement of Martial looking dangerous, but posing little to no danger in controlled possession. The January 2020 arrival of Bruno Fernandes represented a seismic shift in United's tactical capabilities. Starting like a man possessed, 8 goals and 7 assists in his first 14, the Portuguese international finally provided the world-class creator who could help break down the deep block. Fernandes' impact extended beyond mere numbers. Unlike traditional number 10s, he possessed the tactical versatility to drop deep when required. This flexibility solved many problems at the same time. When Matic dropped into the defensive line, Fernandes could provide a reliable progressive passing option, and when the double pivot struggled with progression, he could temporarily assume those responsibilities. And once Pogba returned, things elevated to another level. With a genuine progressive passer alongside Matic, Fernandes could maintain his natural position between the lines, focusing purely on creation, whilst Pogba provided progression and then late runs from deep. Or they could even have situations like this, where the pair could rotate and Bruno was still able to progress from deep. This partnership elevated United's attacking play to new heights, supporting the continued development of Rashford and Martial, who both achieved 17-goal seasons. So, early in the season, to compensate for a lack of creativity, Solskjaer had United pressing high to force turnovers and goal-scoring opportunities, but this would leave them exposed, with De Gea not being a sweeper and Maguire not being quick. But now, they could afford to be more patient in the build-up and the defensive phase, knowing that they didn't have to only create through high turnovers and counter-attacks. The momentum from Bruno's transformative arrival carried United into their first full season under Solskjaer with genuine optimism, and Champions League qualification had exceeded expectations, and the Norwegian finally had the creative fulcrum his system desperately needed. The summer window brought promise rather than revolution. Donny van de Beek arrived from Ajax, theoretically offering rotation for Bruno or Pogba. Alex Telles provided competition for Shaw at left back, but the marquee signing came late and unexpectedly. Edison Cavani on a free transfer, bringing elite movement and experience to a young forward line. Solskjaer's tactical approach had crystallized around the 4-2-3-1, and with good reason. It maximized Fernandes' influence, was providing the defensive stability of a double pivot. The formation had become United's identity. No more switching between diamonds and back threes like in his interim spell. But how did the double pivot suddenly become solid if we've just discussed its limitations when Pogba was often pushing up too high? Well, something interesting was happening. Pogba often wasn't playing. Initially because of injury, but soon it was revealed that there was more than met the eye. Pogba, a season prior, had requested to leave Old Trafford, only to be blocked by Ed Woodward. By the Frenchman's own admission, his focus was no longer as intensely on the Red Devils, leading to performances of fluctuating quality. So the double pivot evolved to be the infamous McFred pairing, which freed Fernandes to focus on having fun between the lines and taking his place as one of the finest creators in the league. But that's not to say Pogba was thrown to the wolves. Against weak sides against whom United couldn't penetrate, he still came in from time to time as an offensive pivot to double up the creative threat. But Solskjaer had another go-to plan. With the double pivot solid unlike other duos before them, and much more mobile, the fullbacks could now push higher up, knowing that they had cover behind them. And the biggest beneficiary of this was Luke Shaw, who with improved fitness would be able to bomb down the flank for 90 minutes. His provision of width allowed Pogba to begin as a winger on paper, then tuck in, allowing United to have a 4 in the midfield. 2 of those defensive, and 2 of those whose entire goal was to create and take shots from range. The increased creativity and goal threat meant that United was slowly getting better at breaking down the low block. That, paired with the arrival of Edinson Cavani, whose game was based around movement in small areas and the box, rather than running into non-existent space behind the defense, meant that United could now do this on a more consistent basis. Additionally, Pogba had the ability to drop deeper at times to help the progression, whilst Bruno stayed high up, meaning that they formed a pseudo-diamond in-game when it was demanded. A second place finish, United's best since Ferguson retired, consistent Champions League qualification, progress to a Europa League final, the trajectory was undeniably upward. And yet, the tactical limitations were equally undeniable. United had become specialists, brilliant in transition, okay in possession, with an over-reliance on 1 or 2 players. They could beat anyone on their day, but struggled for consistency against defensive teams. It crystallized the Solskjaer paradox. He'd restored United's identity, built an exciting team, and achieved somewhat consistent results. But the tactical ceiling was clear. Whilst he was the man to bring them out of their malaise, he was not the man to help the Red Devils take over the world once again. The romance of Ole's interim period had given way to the reality of his tactical limitations, and despite significant investments in the summer of 2021, those limitations would ultimately prove insurmountable, leading to his departure just a few months into the new season.
When Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's romantic experiment finally reached its inevitable conclusion, Manchester United once again turned to a temporary solution. But this appointment carried a different kind of excitement altogether. After the failed phase with an inexperienced manager who knew the club well, the replacement was the antithesis. No affiliation with the club, but bags of experience, not only on how to manage a team, but run a club altogether. Ralf Rangnick arrived not merely as an interim manager, but as the godfather of gegenpressing himself. A tactical innovator whose reputation was built not on silverware, but fundamentally changing how football was played. His influence had shaped an entire generation of German coaches, from Jurgen Klopp to Thomas Tuchel, and his Red Bull empire had become a lab for high-intensity, vertical football. United, it seemed, were finally embracing modernity. Rangnick's immediate tactical revolution came through the abandonment of Solskjaer's familiar 4-2-3-1 in favour of his preferred 4-2-2-2. This radical departure featured 2 strikers up front with 2 narrow attacking midfielders, operating as dual number 10s behind them, creating what Rangnick believed would be the ultimate vertical attacking structure. The theory was compelling, and it is all centered around this word. Firstly, the centre-backs would have an extra option for penetration, compared to a 4-3-3, where there are only 2 lines of progression for the centre-backs. Using the dual 10s as distinct lines introduces an extra layer of depth, making it harder to defend. This formation only allowed a double pivot, which would be perfect for a team without a true world-class pivot, as now both the defensive and ball progression burden could be shared between 2 midfielders, while having 2 close proximity vertical options, again as opposed to the single pivot, makes the centre-backs' lives easier. But the advantages on paper don't end there. Many teams prefer a 4-3-3 formation when defending, and in possession formations like a 4-2-3-1 for example, stumble into the issue that a dedicated destroyer might be able to cut out the creative hydrant. Rangnick's preferred formation circumvents this, as at a moment's notice it can flex into a midfield box, creating a 4 versus 3 advantage that makes the single pivot's life hell. And again, with limited pivots, providing that secondary progressive option and potentially more time to execute the passes due to the 4 versus 3 overload in the midfield should have been invaluable. The 4-2-2-2 also allows ultimate flexibility, as depending on the positioning of the 10s, it can be a central overload with the fullbacks expected to push up, or a wide overload, if the centre forward is willing to temporarily pull out wide. Pair that with the increased box threat of having two centre forwards and things could begin looking scary, as United would now have a highly vertical, penetration-focused passing chain. All of this, of course, was in theory, because reality quickly became very ugly. From deeper positions, only Harry Maguire possessed the technical ability and the vision required for the vertical progression that Rangnick demanded. When opponents successfully pressed the Englishman, neither Raphael Varane nor Victor Lindelof offered reliable alternatives for advancing the ball. This created the familiar pattern of lateral passing and sideways circulation that had plagued United for years. The midfield pivot issues persisted, with predictable consequences. When Paul Pogba operated as one of the two sixes, his progressive passing flourished. But his defensive positioning remained erratic, leaving United vulnerable through the middle. When more defensively solid options like Fred and McTominay filled these roles, the ball progression stagnated entirely, undermining the formation's core premise of vertical penetration. The dual 10 positions revealed the squad's lack of tactical versatility in stark detail. Bruno Fernandes thrived in this setup, operating essentially in his preferred role, with the freedom to drift across the pitch and orchestrate attacks. However, Marcus Rashford's deployment as one of the 10s highlighted the fundamental mismatch between player profiles and tactical demands. Rashford's strengths lay in his pace and directness as an inside forward or a winger, and constraining him to the narrow spaces between the lines neutered his most dangerous attributes. Jadon Sancho offered glimpses of his Borussia Dortmund brilliance in this hybrid winger midfielder role, slowly rediscovering the creativity that had made him one of Europe's most coveted talents, but he still wasn't quite at his best. Anthony Elanga similarly showed promising signs of development, but these individual improvements couldn't mask the systemic issues plaguing the formation. The forwards were another area of struggle. Cavani was the only true centre forward in the squad, but he consistently struggled with injuries and found himself in and out of the side. Greenwood and Rashford were both inside forwards who could do a job at centre forward, so the constant rotation when Sancho was in the side also didn't help their cause, not managing to get double digits in goal contributions in the league between the pair of them. The only man who was able to produce on a consistent basis was of course Ronaldo, who barreled towards 20 goals in the league. He was now much more accustomed to playing centre forward. A lot more than Rashford and Greenwood anyway. But even he wasn't a true centre forward, and when he consistently drifted wide, seeking to produce the magic of his earlier years, United looked toothless in the attack. Rangnick's preferred formation led to a lot of oval pegs in round holes, players operating in their second or third favourite position. In fact, the fullbacks were amongst the very few completely operating in their element, at least on paper, because a lot of onus was placed on them to provide the attacking output. Wan-Bissaka, very much a defensive fullback, had limited attacking potential. Tejas and Dalot did an okay job, with Luke Shaw being the only decent threat from the wider zones. But his injury history was not a thing of the past, missing 18 games in all competitions across 4 injuries. So, what of his plans in defense as the godfather of gegenpressing? Well, in the Premier League, most opponents would be using a back 4, and his formation could be flexible once again. It allowed 2 centre forwards for man-to-man pressure, and the fluid 10s, depending on the matchup, could remain narrow, or push up onto the fullback after filtering the opposition wide. However, effective pressing requires total commitment and coordination, qualities that prove beyond this United squad. Ronaldo's age became a tactical liability in the defensive phase. While he continued to play with the ambition and positioning of his younger self when United had possession, his pressing intensity revealed every one of his 37 years. When the Portuguese failed to engage defensively, the entire pressing structure collapsed, allowing opponents to play through United's aggressive positioning with ease. Yet laying the blame for United's pressing failures at Ronaldo's feet would be intellectual dishonesty. Effective high pressing demands a high defensive line, and United's personnel made this impossible to sustain. Varane's pace and experience proved invaluable when available. But his injury record, missing 19 games across all competitions, meant that United often fielded centre-back partnerships lacking the mobility required for aggressive defending. De Gea's presence between the posts only compounded these issues. The Spaniards' reluctance to sweep up behind the defence meant that United could not maintain the high line essential to Rangnick's pressing philosophy. This created enormous spaces between the defensive line and the pressing forwards, giving opponents more time and space to exploit. Rangnick was struggling. And then suddenly, a man with an incredibly strong tactical identity had to bow to the pressure. It was not long until Rangnick abandoned his beloved 4-2-2-2, and the admission came publicly and painfully. The tactical retreat to a more conventional 4-3-3 structure provided marginal improvements. More players were now operating in familiar positions. Fernandes resumed his natural role between the lines, and the presence of dedicated wingers restored some threat from the wide regions. Fred's deployment as a box-to-box midfielder better suited his energy and work rate, while the return to conventional positioning reduced the constant tactical confusion that had plagued the earlier experiments. However, the improvements were surface level rather than fundamental. United progressed from poor to merely mediocre, still lacking the systematic coherence for sustained success. The formation change addressed symptoms rather than causes, papering over the deeper structural issues that Rangnick had identified from his first weeks in charge. Perhaps Rangnick's most valuable contribution came not through his tactical innovations, but through his broader analysis of United's institutional failures. His experience running clubs and revolutionizing Germany's footballing infrastructure provided a perspective that transcended match-by-match tactical concerns. He knew that something more fundamental was wrong with a footballing organization than just a pressing structure. His diagnosis was damning but accurate.
Crystal clear. It's not that difficult. You don't even need glasses to analyze and to see where the problems are. So now it's only about how do we solve them. It's not enough to do some little minor amendments, some little issues here and there, some minor cosmetic things. No. In medicine, you would see this is an operation at the open heart.
But as only the interim manager, Rangnick would not be the man to see the surgery through. In the end, Rangnick became another casualty of United's post-Ferguson revolving door, but his brief tenure illuminated both the possibilities and the limitations of tactical revolution. His 4-2-2-2 experiment failed, not because the system was flawed, but because football clubs cannot be transformed through tactics alone. Sometimes, much deeper changes are needed. Manchester United needed a spark, and one man had been quietly orchestrating one of football's most compelling revival stories. Ten Hag had rescued Ajax from a dry spell, turning them into consistent champions in the Eredivisie and the Dutch Cups, as well as having a deep run in the Champions League. Put simply, his revival of one European giant had raised hopes that he could do it elsewhere. And again, here was a manager with a strong identity. High possession, high pressing, with an emphasis on attack. Yet reservations lingered beneath the excitement. While Ten Hag's reputation extended far beyond the Netherlands, no major European club had been brave enough to test whether his methods could translate to the highest level under the highest scrutiny. As the 2022-23 season approached, Manchester United took the plunge. But something felt fundamentally different about this appointment. After having two managers who were at least at certain points temporary, Ten Hag was the first man the board had had time to vet and select. They were ready to back their man, and it showed in the transfer market. Over 200 million euros were spent, nearly 100 on Antony and 71 million on a 30-year-old Casemiro. The turnover continued with outgoing signings. All the signs were right from Ten Hag. He talked the talk and was keen to show that he had the strength of leadership to run one of the world's most popular clubs. Established pros like Pogba, Matic, Mata, Lingard and Cavani were all immediately let go on free transfers. The words were right from Ten Hag.
In this moment, really fantastic football, both Liverpool and Man City. But you will always see an era can come to an end.
But were the tactics? The assumption was Ten Hag would look to transplant his ideals onto the Red Devils. After all, high possession, high pressing, high identity football seemed to have become the default for sides who saw themselves as the elite. But reality, very quickly and very harshly, slapped Ten Hag in the face. His opening 2 Premier League matches saw United concede 6 goals, 2 to Brighton and 4 to Brentford. But why was that? Was it because the Eredivisie was some inferior league and Ten Hag was secretly a fraud who couldn't handle the super special Premier League? Well, of course not, because after those 2 initial losses, United went on a 4-match winning streak, and a closer look at the performances reveals a key issue that Ten Hag would face. Against Brighton, United ended with 62% possession, and against Brentford, that number rose to 66%. Compare that to their 4-match winning streak. Ten Hag had walked into a trap. His entire tactical philosophy was built on high possession, but he'd been handed a side that was designed to do anything but that. His deeper 7 could look like this to start off with. Teams immediately recognized the opportunity and would apply immediate pressure. Martinez is a good ball-playing centre-back, and he was much better suited to handling the pressure. And similarly, Maguire at right centre-back was more than serviceable on the ball. But with the play inevitably beginning from the goalkeeper, if the opposition pushed up early, it meant that these better ball players were under copious amounts of pressure, with the opposition backing up the press onto the fullbacks. It was a recipe for disaster, with De Gea almost always making the wrong decision of when to go long and when to play short into a teammate, meaning that De Gea was either playing it into a non-technical pivot under extreme amounts of pressure, or needlessly throwing the ball away when the pivot was free, with very little in between. The McFred double pivot became the embodiment of United's possession problems. Neither Fred nor Scott McTominay possessed the technical security or vision required for Ten Hag's systematic build-up. When forced to receive passes under pressure, they invariably chose the safe option, back to the centre-backs or sideways to each other, rather than the progressive passes that Ten Hag's system demanded. But early in his tenure, Ten Hag was in problem-solving mode, trying to make the side work to his liking. Christian Eriksen had been a free signing, but it was quite clear he was becoming a key cog in the side. While he was traditionally thought of as a 10, that was the one position that United did not need any reinforcement. So instead, Ten Hag used him in the pivot role that he had been seeing more and more of anyway. Would he finally be the technically secure midfielder to get the side ticking? Well, to a certain extent, but even a player as good as he was constantly put into tricky situations, as again, De Gea would either completely ignore him when he was free, or find him at the worst possible moments under high pressure. The systemic problems ran deeper than any individual solution could address. So the obvious approach when the short game is faltering is to go long, and with a player with as much aerial ability as Ronaldo, that seemed like potentially a good play. But there were two problems with this. As more and more of the side dropped deeper to help the poor build-up, it left Ronaldo isolated up top, with no one to flick the ball onto, or having to hold it up for too long. And that's only when he was on the pitch, because pretty early on, Ten Hag was making it clear that Ronaldo was not a part of his long-term plans, with Eriksen actually beginning the first encounter as the false 9 who would be able to drop deep and help the midfield overload. This obviously hamstrung the possibility of playing over the press, but moving higher up the pitch, Ten Hag continued to make his philosophy clear. It centered around creating numerical advantages in specific zones, overloads that would allow quick combinations and penetrative passes. In the first phase of build-up, he typically wanted to construct a back 3 to ensure numerical superiority against the pressing opposition. But with De Gea essentially non-existent when United had possession, he would not be the man to push high up to create the 3 versus 2 in the first line. So to start off with, this role had to be filled by a pivot. In the early stages of his reign, his commitment to playing his style of football meant that Ten Hag initially looked to drop either Fred or McTominay deep to allow a semblance of ball-playing ability in the back line. But eventually, that had become Casemiro once more, and Ten Hag had the defensive midfielder dropping deep to create the back 3. This led to a cascade of problems. Dropping the midfielder deep reduced United's presence in the middle third, making it easier for opponents to press the remaining midfielders. His solution was characteristically bold. From the very first match, he was willing to drop Cristiano Ronaldo in favour of Eriksen as a false 9 for these very situations, as it allowed the Dane to drop deep into the midfield while creating space for the inside forwards to attack. But the personnel limitations persisted. When Casemiro was dropping deep, his ball progression was adequate but uninspiring. He was fundamentally a defensive midfielder rather than a deep-lying playmaker, so even having him be the third centre-back was not ideal. This was why during his golden spell at Real Madrid, Toni Kroos and Luka Modric would drop towards the ball to dictate possession, rather than rely on the Brazilians' distribution. Ten Hag's solution required further compromise. This is why, as we touched on, Eriksen became that pivot early on, with Rashford rather than Ronaldo coming in up top. So with Eriksen now doing the progression, it did help matters. But now with a centre forward who liked to run in behind rather than come deep in the midfield like Eriksen was initially doing, the final third overloads that Ten Hag craved were being undermined. But this was only temporary, as Ten Hag changed tact once again. He shifted to a 3-1-6 shape in possession. The right back, whether Wan-Bissaka or more often Dalot, as Ten Hag preferred his ball-playing ability, would drop alongside the centre-backs, allowing the the rest of the side to push forward and create massive overloads in the attacking zones. In the best situations, this structure was devastating. United could create quick combinations around the penalty area with multiple players capable of receiving between the lines and creating chances. The theoretical advantages were compelling. How could any defense cope with 6 attackers in advanced positions? But Ten Hag had again designed a system with a single point of failure: the extreme isolation of the single pivot with limited ability on the ball. And once again, the opposition had multiple options: press high and cut out the pivot entirely, forcing United into panicked long balls, or sit deep and force the pivot, usually Casemiro, to be the primary creative outlet, knowing his limitations in these scenarios. But Ten Hag did not become United manager for no reason. Again, he began to search for solutions to address the flaw. Luke Shaw's role became more inverted, tucking inside to provide a secondary outlet option in the central areas. He was the most technically gifted of United's fullbacks, making this a logical adaptation. However, a Shaw-Casemiro double pivot, while improved, hardly represented world-class possession play. Eriksen then would instead drop deeper, allowing Shaw to advance, which showed marked improvement in United's build-up fluidity. However, teams just began prioritizing cutting out Eriksen entirely, recognizing him as United's most dangerous progressive passer, and instead trying to force the owners to be pushed onto Casemiro. More support was needed around Casemiro, slowly forcing Ten Hag's elaborate overloads to collapse, as United were compelled to drop deeper to help with the progression. The Dutchman flirted with a Madrid-like adaptation, having someone else, Eriksen, handle all of the progression whilst pushing Casemiro high. And he ran into a problem Madrid had, which is that now Casemiro was in the 10 position and looked extremely clunky. But Ten Hag also ran into a problem that Madrid hadn't had, as United only had one man to do the progression from the midfield instead of the 2 that Madrid had had. It just wasn't working. But if they were struggling centrally, perhaps the salvation could be found out wide. The issue, however, was there wasn't much to be happy about on the flanks either. When it was the fullbacks who were providing the width, Shaw could certainly be effective at times when delivering from the flanks, while Tejes on the left and Dalot on the right could be described as serviceable, with Wan-Bissaka's strengths being heavily going backwards rather than forwards. The wingers also brought varied fortunes. Both Sancho and Antony lacked the confidence that had oozed from them at their prior clubs. In fact, the only bright spark was Rashford, who was splitting time between centre forward and the left wing, where especially when Shaw was overlapping outside of him, he could look deadly. In other words, unless Rashford was also wide, the threat was extremely limited, contributing to United only scoring the 9th most goals in Ten Hag's debut season. But in a strange way, Rashford's incredible performances should have served as warning signs. The in-possession issues were now being combined with out-of-possession issues. Like Ralf Rangnick before him, Ten Hag discovered that whilst high pressing was fundamental to his philosophy, it was simply impossible with his personnel. The squad was ill-suited to the intensity and the coordination required, including some of his own signings. Casemiro and Eriksen, whilst players with a lot of pedigree, lacked the pressing intensity required for his system. When Ronaldo was on the pitch, effective pressing became impossible. The Portuguese superstar's reluctance to engage defensively meant that the entire pressing structure collapsed, allowing opponents to play through United's aggressive positioning with ease. One malfunctioning cog was enough to break the entire machine. The situation had become so desperate that Ten Hag resorted to loaning in Weghorst from Burnley mid-season, deploying the limited striker as a pressing 10 in an attempt to fix the system's defensive phase. It was a telling indicator of the lengths he had gone to maintain some semblance of his playing style. All of this meant it was hard for United to keep the ball, and when they lost it, it was difficult for them to win the ball back quickly. While this represented a tactical retreat from Ten Hag's original vision, it created unexpected opportunities. By naturally inviting opponents forward, United created space in behind for their pace merchants to exploit. Having assessed his squad's limitations, Ten Hag embraced a new objective that would have been sacrilege at Ajax. We want to be the best transition side in the world. The groundwork had been laid during his first season. Despite their possession struggles, United were devastating on the counter-attack. Rashford was the primary beneficiary, equaling his best ever Premier League tally, not through transformation into a complete striker, but through exploiting the transitional opportunities that Ten Hag's adapted system was creating. But the issue was obvious. Why was a manager with such a strong identity brought in to fulfill that identity now completely changing tact to become transition-oriented? Was he losing his identity? And if he was he at least committed to this new transitional philosophy? And would his new signings reflect this? In a nutshell, Ten Hag's tactical plans were becoming unclear, and despite that declaration to become the best transition side in the world, Ten Hag's actions suggested otherwise. The signing of Andre Onana for €50 million to replace De Gea was a clear signal that he hadn't abandoned his possession principles. Onana was everything that De Gea wasn't: comfortable with the ball at his feet, willing to sweep behind the high line, and capable of playing line-breaking passes that could escape entire pressing lines. Whilst on the other hand, De Gea was more suited to stop the myriad of shots that transitional sides tend to face. The addition of Mason Mount for €55 million was even more telling. Mount was a lot better with the ball at his feet, creating or linking the play rather than running with the ball at his feet on the transition like a McTominay. And to top it all off, Mount was a great pressing midfielder. So despite what he had stated, Ten Hag's new tactical setup suggested anything but directness, but instead a return to his possession philosophy: dominate possession, press aggressively, and suffocate opponents through positional superiority. And his early formations indicated as such, as he moved towards a 4-3-3, with Mount and Fernandes operating as free eights in the half spaces. This ideal formation was very short-lived, as Mason Mount's injury record for the season looked like this, while Luke Shaw equally saw a return of his injuries. But even when Mount was present, the issues persisted for United. A lack of progression through the centre again, as once again Casemiro was isolated. And now, without Shaw to occasionally beef up the midfield by inverting, Dalot could try to invert at times. But in general, it meant dropping either Fernandes or Mount deeper, reducing the efficacy of the free eights high up, looking to overload the final line. One quirk that Ten Hag did look to implement was having the right centre-back push higher into the midfield, and instead having the right-back drop deeper to provide the passing option to Onana. The theory was sound: increase the bodies in midfield to improve the progression, whilst allowing Mount and Fernandes to remain high, helping the numerical superiority. However, this often meant two technically limited players sharing progression from the pivot positions rather than suddenly becoming better at progressing the ball. In fact, one of the primary aims of this automatism was to find the right back in room with time to get his head up and have a better chance of progressing the ball. But when the receiver was under pressure, Dalot, or especially Wan-Bissaka when he was at right back, they tended to wilt. But there were issues even deeper on the pitch. Onana as a ball-playing keeper was meant to be a sure thing. He was meant to be the goalkeeper that would revolutionize United's build-up play, but instead he yielded mixed results. Initially there were promising signs. Onana would invite pressure, then split the press with a precise pass, something that De Gea rarely attempted. His distribution occasionally led to direct chances for United, most notably in Champions League matches, where his sweeping ability also allowed United to play a high line. But the nerviness of the United players in possession seemed to infect the once steel-nerved goalkeeper, and in fact, by the season's end, Onana was frequently bypassing the short build-up and hitting longer balls, essentially doing what De Gea did in possession, albeit with slightly better accuracy. The revolution in playing style led by Onana never materialized. Instead, United got a goalkeeper whose shot stopping was questionable, whilst his distribution advantages were being negated by the chaos around him. But the best example of the increasingly vague philosophy of Ten Hag was in the defensive stance. An unprecedented injury crisis meant constant shuffling of the defensive personnel, resulting in a back four unfamiliar with each other and physically inferior to previous combinations. But the United front six continued pressing high, under Ten Hag's instructions, but on the other hand, the defensive four, uncertain and insecure, tended to drop deep to minimize the risk of through balls that would expose them physically. It was a total disconnect. This created an enormous gap in the midfield that left Casemiro more isolated than ever, stranded on a tactical island between the aggressive press and conservative defense. The disconnect epitomized Ten Hag's struggles to reconcile his philosophical beliefs with Manchester United's practical limitations. Rashford's dramatic decline compounded these issues, no longer producing the explosive transitional moments that had defined his previous season. United looked very blunt in the area that was supposed to now represent their tactical strength. A combination of poor team cohesion and individual regression meant that even their supposed plan B was failing. And perhaps fittingly, that lack of cohesion was present even in the upper echelons in the club during the off-season. The official stance from United was that they backed Ten Hag, However, it was well publicised that they spent the summer pursuing several other managers, undermining Ten Hag in public. Upon failing to upgrade managers, United were still willing to splurge over €200 million to help mould the team into his image, a moulding that would only be given a couple of months into the new season to continue, as not long into the fresh campaign, Ten Hag was shown the door. Ruben Amorim was next to dine at the Manchester United table, and right from the off, Amorim knew he was in shaky territory with United. He was reluctant to join mid-season after taking a single look at the squad. They did not have the makings of a great Amorim side. His preference was clear: wait until the summer, have a comprehensive squad reconstruction, and then begin their tactical revolution. But United were insistent. The reality was, United aside, the Premier League's elite clubs appeared settled with their managerial futures for the foreseeable. For an ambitious coach seeking to test himself at the highest level, opportunities of United's magnitude don't come about very often, regardless of the club's current dysfunction. So Amorim reluctantly accepted his seat at the head of United's table, fully aware he was about to sip from a poisoned chalice that had claimed numerous managers before him. From his first day, Amorim faced a fundamental choice that would define his tenure. He could choose to paper over the cracks, changing his system and philosophy to suit the available players, and simply extract the maximum performance from them until summer reconstruction became possible. Alternatively, he could stay strong and try to impose his tactical will immediately, forcing players to adapt to his methods, while using the remainder of the season as an extended addition to identify those who merited inclusion in his long-term plans. Amorim chose principle over pragmatism. After all, principle without sacrifice is just preference. So rather than compromise his tactical identity for short-term results, he viewed the situation as an opportunity to separate the tactically adaptable from the systematically incompatible. This approach, whilst admirable in its conviction, produced results that exceeded even the most pessimistic expectations. Amorim immediately pivoted United to his preferred back three system, implementing a 3-4-3 in every league fixture, with the same unwavering commitment he had shown at Sporting. It was a flexible formation, particularly in these positions, as depending on the encounter, Amorim could have them wide, trying to stretch the defense, or narrow, looking to overload instead. On the bright side, some of the signings from the last gasp backing of Ten Hag had potential upside, as a few of the players looked more suited to Amorim's possession and high line style, like Yoro, De Ligt, Mazraoui and Xerxes. This would have been good news for Amorim, but there were a few issues, namely Yoro getting injured early on, and Xerxes struggling to get adapted to the league in the early stages. Despite the formation change, United's build-up unit revealed familiar weaknesses, disguised by different positioning. While some areas possessed decent ball-playing ability, others remained systematically vulnerable to pressure. But there is an elephant in the room. Onana is considered a ball-playing goalkeeper and has undoubtedly consistently shown that ability in the past. But for some reason, since joining Old Trafford, at times it's as though this ability has completely abandoned him. Now, he ranks lowly for passes completed, pass completion percentage, pass length, and so much more. So the ball-playing ability of their deepest unit on paper was even lower in reality. Like you see here, with the wider centre-backs under pressure and Onana being closed down, he immediately gives the ball away. The opposition once again had two options to disrupt United. The first was to continue the ambition of pressing high. Because here's the thing, Amorim had a quirk reminiscent of Ten Hag, despite using a back three. Often from deep situations, the central centre-back, primarily De Ligt, would be instructed to push up alongside the pivot to allow Casemiro to get some help in the build-up by having a secondary outlet option, while also generally increasing their midfield numbers, as they had only had two dedicated midfielders before this move. But once again, this had some issues. Firstly, De Ligt can absolutely be considered a ball-playing centre-back. However, there is a big difference between a ball-playing centre-back and a press-resistant pivot expected to operate under pressure consistently. So it essentially meant that teams could be fairly confident that when they pressed United in their deeper zones, they could get errors out of the Red Devils. But the opposition also had the option to sit off completely. Firstly, taking one of United's better ball players on paper out of the equation, as Onana would now be too deep to contribute. But what was also interesting is that a key feature of back three systems is having wide centre-backs who drive with the ball into the midfield to try and bait defences out of position. But initially under Amorim, there was very little of that happening, perhaps wary of any counter-attacks that may come back the other way. Again, this made them less dangerous in possession, as the back three could struggle to directly penetrate deeper blocks through passing. But here's the thing about United's recruitment. They brought in another deeper midfielder in Ugarte, who looked promising on paper, but did not fix their in-possession play one bit. Ugarte is decent enough with the ball at his feet. Not a complete disaster by any means, but he's miles away from being the elite, press-resistant, line-breaking deep-line playmaker that United have been crying out for since Carrick's legs went. But when opposition teams sat deep, even with this additional midfielder available, the same old problems surfaced. If Ugarte got pressed when receiving the ball, he struggled under the pressure. But if he wasn't pressed, opponents knew there was virtually no risk of penetration. They could let him have the ball all day long, knowing he wasn't going to hurt them with a killer pass. Even when he temporarily dropped into the backline to collect possession, teams were comfortable allowing him time and space because they knew what was coming. Safe, sideways circulation. The result? Amorim's United could rack up impressive possession stats at times, but this never translated into genuine threat on the opposition goal. But things got worse, because the sterile 3-2-5 shape was one of the better outcomes for United. That's because the transition from Ten Hag to Amorim marked one of the first times there was genuine continuity between managerial philosophies. Both coaches favoured high pressure combined with possession dominance, and crucially, both attempted to implement versions of a 3-1-6 formation at various points, seeking to overload the final third and overwhelm the opposition through numerical superiority. The problem? Amorim ran into exactly the same issues that had torpedoed Ten Hag's experiments. Casemiro simply wasn't up to the job, whether as a press-resistant single pivot responsible for deep progression, or as an advanced playmaker operating between the lines if it was his partner being the single pivot. Ugarte's arrival did not solve this fundamental issue. It just added another adequate but uninspiring option to United's midfield pool in possession. So Amorim had to look for a solution, and his first attempt involved dropping Fernandes from his natural advanced position to operate alongside the pivot as the primary ball player. On the surface, this made tactical sense. Bruno had the tactical ability and the vision to provide the progressive passing that United desperately needed from these deep zones. The upside was undeniable. He genuinely improved United's build-up play in those zones, finally giving them a midfielder capable of finding players between the lines and switching the play effectively. The caveat was significant though. His natural appetite for risk-taking became a double-edged sword when he was deployed deeper. Those game-changing switches and line-breaking passes that made him so dangerous in advanced areas could become costly turnovers when attempted from positions where possession retention was more crucial. Here's where the knock-on effects became really problematic. United had taken their one genuinely world-class outfield player and stuck him in a position where he was competent but not exceptional. Yes, Bruno could play deeper, but it wasn't where he was world-class. Meanwhile, replacing him in his natural role represented a significant downgrade. Eriksen, despite his undeniable technical gifts, just isn't the mobile, dynamic number 10 he used to be. Age had caught up with him, and his impact in the final third was a shadow of his former self. The legs had gone, and with them, much of his effectiveness in tight spaces. Diallo has been one of the few bright sparks in United's lineup, always showing willing and flashes of genuine quality. But his best moments consistently came when he drifted wide to attack from favourable positions rather than trying to create centrally. It's a similar story with the temperamental Garnacho. Both players thrive when given space to run at defenders rather than being asked to unlock compact defences through intricate passing. The positional switch also created defensive complications. Fernandes belongs to that rare breed of players who will press relentlessly for 90 minutes. An absolute weapon when deployed as a number 10, but potentially problematic as a deeper midfielder. His natural aggressiveness and work rate, while admirable, could lead to overzealous pressing at inappropriate moments when operating as part of a double pivot. And when he did press aggressively from the deeper zone, he often left his midfield partner completely isolated. It's the kind of tactical indiscipline that the best teams can exploit through quick passing combinations, turning United's pressing intensity into structural weaknesses. All of these factors combined to create a perfect storm of creative creative sterility, limited penetration to find advanced players in dangerous positions, their best creator deployed out of his optimal position, and opposition teams being comfortable sitting deep, knowing that United could not hurt them. The result has been a dramatic dulling of United's goal threat. The most damning statistic? Well, Højlund averaged 1 shot per game, which is essentially pointless for a striker. Compare that to Haaland and Salah, who are registering more than triple that output, and the scale of United's creative deficit becomes apparent. The issue isn't just individual quality, instead it's strayed into systematic failure. The Amorim chapter for now is far from over, but his early experiences perfectly illustrate the scale of issues United have been grappling with for more than a decade. Different managers, different formations, but the same fundamental problems keep surfacing. Not enough technical quality in key positions, recruitment that prioritizes names over systematic fit, and an institutional inability to address root causes rather than the symptoms. Amorim has been gifted another season to prove himself, but how do you see it going? Leave it down below. And don't forget to check out the free resource down below. And also, if you're interested in joining Tactical Mastery, just a heads up that with the season starting, the off-season offer ends this week. So secure it now if that sounds interesting to you.